Welcome to 1,000 Ways to Heal. I would like to invite you onto the land with me this week, where I continue to share my personal journey of healing, inspired by my diverse heritage, aiming to encourage and support your healing journey to wellness and unity. Indian hospitals, like residential schools and reserves in Canada, were institutions established to segregate, isolate, and control Indigenous people. Despite increased awareness about residential schools due to efforts like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Orange Shirt Day, Indian hospitals remain largely unknown to non-Indigenous Canadians. Operating from the 1930s to the 1980s, Indian hospitals saw a rapid expansion during the tuberculosis epidemic in the 1940s. As TB rates among Indigenous peoples were notably higher than the national average, these hospitals primarily served to isolate Indigenous individuals sick with TB, perpetuating racist myths about their susceptibility to the disease. Linked closely with residential schools, Indian hospitals were funded and administered by the Canadian government, often occupying buildings already owned by the federal government or repurposing missionary hospitals and residential schools themselves. The entanglement between these institutions meant that children infected with TB at residential schools were often sent to Indian hospitals for treatment, sometimes without parental consent or knowledge. It should also be acknowledged that many patients did not survive the hospitals, including many children, and that their families were not always notified of their deaths. Indigenous patients at Indian hospitals were subjected to abusive treatment and held against their will, as an amendment to the Indian Act in 1953 made it illegal for Indigenous people to refuse medical treatment or to leave hospitals before discharge. Lack of cultural safety, underfunding, and understaffing plagued these institutions, leading to confusion, isolation, and loneliness among the Indigenous patients. Experimental treatments were inflicted without consent, and invasive surgeries were performed long after they had ceased in general hospitals. Younger patients, who naturally wished to move around more, would sometimes be restrained to their beds through the use of straps, caging, and casts. Currently, 29 hospitals across Canada are named in a class action lawsuit against the federal government, highlighting the historical injustices suffered by Indigenous peoples in these institutions. Despite their closure or repurposing by the 1980s, the legacy of Indian Hospital continues to haunt Indigenous communities, demanding acknowledgement and redress. Remember, we heal when we walk together. I'm Ryan Deneault.